I'm Grant Walker. Thanks for listening and welcome to Last Call for Thursday the 23rd of July. I'll be back with Heads Up Friday, 10 a.m. To dairy farmers and insurance, dairy farmers should check they have a code of compliance for any new sheds or risk their insurance cover. Timaru District Council has sent building owners 24 monthly letters requesting what stage the building consent is at and remind them to apply for a code of compliance certificate once work is completed. Building Control Manager Grant Hyde says some dairy shed owners were ignoring the letters. The council had received reports of 54 dairy sheds in the district that appeared to be ready for a certificate but did not have one. He warned that owners without a compliance certificate might not be covered by insurance policies for their sheds. The council's advice is limited to the district, but the trend is likely to be nationwide, he says. The Building Act 2004 states building owners must apply for a certificate as soon as practicable after the building work is completed. The council found out about the issue after Environment Canterbury maintenance checks on the shed's backflow prevention devices resulted in inspectors sending the results to the council for filing. Let's talk retirement. The head of the Retirement Village Association says perceptions of retirement villages are changing as increasingly better facilities bump up resident satisfaction levels. Executive Director John Collins told NBR Radio, "We all know that the numbers of over 75-year-olds are increasing, but what's particularly important for us is the percentage of this age group choosing to live in retirement villages is also increasing." A resident survey commissioned by the association gives the sector a net promoter score of 47, which Mr Collins says is one of the highest scored for an industry, as anything above 0 is considered good. The research also shows residents in New Zealand are almost twice as satisfied with retirement village living as their Australian counterparts. Mr Collins says demand is increasing as village residents recommend the benefits of living in a retirement village, including security, companionship and releasing equity from a home to friends and family. He says, "Since I first started with the association almost 8 years ago, the number of over 75s living in a retirement village has doubled. What's happened is retirement villages have gone from a fringe option to something considered a mainstream housing option for our older people. This bodes well for the sector as growth in this age group will fuel demand and there's plenty of room for expansion." New research from JLL shows the growth within the over 75 age group is forecast to grow at a greater rate than the over 65 age group, reflecting that not only does New Zealand have an ageing population, but also that this demographic is likely to live longer than previous generations. The over 75 age group has projected growth of 193% from 2013 to 2043, while the proportion of the population within this age group is forecast to increase from 6% in 2013 to 14% in 2043. Based on Stats New Zealand's median population projections, there is a demand for 13.6 new villages a year between 2013 and 2043. Last year, there was clear growth in village numbers across every region with the exception of the West Coast. At the end of 2014, there were 363 villages operating in New Zealand, an increase of 12 from 2013. Of these, 75 were located in Auckland, 66 in Canterbury and 39 in the Bay of Plenty.
This is NBR Radio on Thursday, July 23rd, Armo in Poland. The Briscoe Group's formal takeover offer for Kathmandu is due to be nailed to shareholders tomorrow after the takeovers panel granted a necessary waiver on Wednesday. Joining me for more on that story is Tim Hunter. Tim?
Yes, hello. It's been a little bit of a kind of hiatus, really, for this particular takeover. We heard about it late last month, in fact, and obviously, Briscoe Group was prepared to make a very detailed offer to the market, and it's we've been waiting for the formal offer to take place for a couple of weeks now, really. Basically, the delay has been put down to this need to gain a waiver from the takeovers panel. As I understand it, that waiver has now been granted, and the formal offer will be out there tomorrow, and so the process can really begin in earnest.
It will be very interesting because the timing is interesting for Kathmandu in particular, right in the middle of winter, which is their key trading period. So is there going to be some questions around certainty of valuations? Is that one question?
Well, that's the obvious number one question, really, is the amount and whether it's going to be enough to persuade shareholders that it's worth joining in with Briscoe. Kathmandu analysts are saying that the company has basically had a much improved trading period this winter. As an outdoor equipment and clothing retailer, they are quite influenced by the weather conditions and people rushing in to buy more warm clothes in winter time, and we've had a very cold winter so far, which is good for trading, and analysts are upgrading their forecasts of results for Kathmandu because of that. So that's certainly one aspect of valuation that will be affecting the outcome in this case.
And the other one, I guess, is the very heavy scrip component in this offer.
Yes, I heard an interesting take on that just the other day. Given the exchange rate changes that are happening as a result of our interest rate, the exchange rate has gone down against the US dollar, and somebody was saying, oh well, maybe that'll affect Briscoe, for example, because it imports a fair bit of its materials that it sells in its shops, and a lower exchange rate can make that more expensive and consequently affect its profit margins. The other aspect of that is it could equally affect Kathmandu. So in the long run, it's not clear whether that's going to be persuasive. But I think with these takeover offers, the general assumption is that the first offer is never the final offer. So I think it's reasonable to assume we're going to see some more on that one.
Yeah, early days, but a really fascinating bid between two of our best known and biggest retailers.
That's right.
Indeed. Thanks. That's Tim Hunter.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant now offering Auckland's most exclusive private dining room. NBR Radio.
This is NBR Radio on Thursday, July 23rd. I'm Owen Poland, and welcome to our weekly edition of Market Talk. Joining me are Mark Lister of Craig's Investment Partners, and in the studio, NBR's Duncan Bridgman. Mark, firstly to you, the top 50 index closing in on 6,000 points, close to an all-time high. What's driving the market at the moment?
Yeah, the local market's had a good run of late, back up at levels that we haven't seen since March. So it's been about a 4% rebound from a few weeks back when we were sort of in the thick of the Greece debacle. I think the key thing of late has just been the realisation that we're going to see more OCR cuts and the weakness in the currency, and that's given the market a little bit of a boost. Many of our stocks, obviously, good dividend payers, and the dairy sector isn't actually that well represented on our market. So they've actually seen the benefits of those developments rather than felt the effects.
Yeah, which companies are benefiting from the lower dollar? Obviously, F&P Healthcare is one that stands out. Any others that spring to mind? We've seen a little bit of a shift in sentiment.
Well, F&P Healthcare is obviously the key one, and certainly in terms of the large companies. But look, I think it's quite across the board. You think about some of the smaller companies on our market. The likes of Scales or Comvita or Delegates, companies that are exporting their products across the world and their non-dairy sort of products. Also, the tourism sector gets a big boost from what you've seen in the currency. So you're seeing that in sort of the operating statistics from the likes of Air New Zealand and Auckland Airport, sort of people coming through the gates. So it's reasonably broad-based. No one's got quite the leverage to it that Fisher & Paykel Healthcare has, but certainly a lot of other players that will see some incremental gains.
Yep.
Yesterday, AGM, the Zero held its AGM and said it was postponing a float in the US for at least another year. What are the key takeouts from your perspective, Mark?
Yeah, the key takeaways there are just subscriber numbers. Reaching 150,000 subscribers, more than 540,000 worldwide. Subscription revenues look pretty good, likely to exceed 200 million for the full year. Now that's a bit slower than what we saw in the previous year in terms of revenue growth, but obviously coming off a much higher base. So that was, I guess, the first thing that the market was looking for, and also those comments, as you mentioned, about listing in the US. They did confirm that it's still on the cards, but certainly not before the release of the 2016 results, sort of which will be May next year.
Yeah, Mark, it's still quite a difficult company to value, I guess, and over the years people have had different sort of valuation methods, and I see today or yesterday Motley Fool came out and they've sort of taken a disliking to the price levels at the moment and said that they think it's sort of overvalued, and you get these from time to time. But do you think that as we go on, we're not seeing a justification for the share price at the moment?
Oh, look, it's really difficult, as you mentioned, to get a handle on the value of it, because most of the value is in the future growth, and that's really difficult to predict, as it is with a lot of technology companies that are growing very fast. So, the shares got as high as $45. Now they're sort of back, been trading around that 17, 18 level for some time now. You ask 5 people, you get 5 different points of view. So, I think when you're investing in stocks like this, you do have to believe the story and believe in that sort of growth profile that they've got ahead of them. But, you'll still find some pretty polarised views out there in the market.
I thought there was some admirable transparency from Rod Drury in terms of saying, we need to get our leadership team locked in, and also that their brand was hardly measurable in the US. So that's encouraging.
Yeah, I think, things are going pretty well for them, but he's been reasonably realistic, hasn't he, in terms of his comments about not getting the leadership team sort of quite right. And I think that's always difficult when you're a small player in a big market like that. You're never going to get the team that you want until you've got a little bit more behind you and you're known a little bit more. Now, they certainly are in New Zealand and Australia, but in the US, still very much a minnow. So, time will tell whether they can change that and ultimately whether they can attract sort of higher profile staff that sort of want to get behind them.
You're listening to Market Talk with Mark Lister of Craig's Investment Partners and NBR's Duncan Bridgman. A really interesting Auckland Council meeting going on this afternoon, Duncan. There seems to be a proposal to sell assets and possibly including shares in Auckland Airport and the ports in Auckland. Is that ever likely to happen?
That sort of pops up from time to time, and I think there's been some comments around this, and they're going to be discussing it today. I think, Len Brown's certainly opposed to this, and he said so in the past, and so while with the current council makeup, I don't think it's going to happen very quickly, but there are those on the right side, on the right-leaning councillors who would be supportive of this. I think Cameron Brewer's one who's quite a proponent of privatisation there. And look, as a ratepayer myself, I'm pretty keen for the council to find some other ways of raising some funds to pay for their expenditure program over the years, and they need to find some money from somewhere. Also, and I think this has been said before as well, if you do put more of these assets on the share market, like the ports of Auckland, for example, you're going to get a better performance out of it.
Mark, do you think there'd be much of a market appetite for Auckland infrastructure?
Oh, I think there certainly would. Look, these are the types of assets that investors really like, and you only need to look at the ones that are already listed. Auckland Airport obviously already is, but Port of Tauranga as well. That's Ports of Auckland's key competitor, and they've got a similar mixed ownership model where the council retains an interest, but it's also listed, and it's been a pretty good performer, I think most people would argue. And so, I don't think that people should be afraid of sell downs. You can do it the right way. You can continue to keep a financial interest, and it can be win-win for everybody.
Now, the retirement company Somerset has acquired an interest in 2.5 hectares of land in the wealthy suburb of St John's for a new village. Investors seem to be liking this stock, Mark.
Yeah, Somerset's had a great run, and it's been a string of good news. We saw a couple of weeks back some earnings guidance, which was effectively an upgrade, well above the prior year and above market expectations. So it got a bit of a boost then. And also with the announcement earlier in the week that they've bought another site in the eastern suburbs of Auckland. So that's their sixth Auckland village, obviously a very fast-growing region with a big catchment. So the markets liked the sound of a greater focus on Auckland, and things seem to be going very well. They've got the village in Ellerslie, which is the one up there that's currently under construction, due to be opened late next year. So just another leg in the growth story, I think.
Yeah, it seems to be the good news keeps on coming for the company, and this exposure to some of the, I suppose, better parts of Auckland sort of has to be good, and gives it a bit more of a diverse locale. And I think there's a quite intense competition out there between these providers like Ryman and MetLife Care as well. Is there much more capacity out there, Mark, do you think, for these villages?
Well, every time you sort of take a step back and look at the demographic trends and profiles, you really come away thinking, geez, the sector is very well positioned, because there's just so many more people moving into that age group that they target. So I think the demographics are well and truly on the side of these provided, which makes them all very good long-term growth stories and investment opportunities. The big question is how much of that is priced in, and many would argue that with the strength that we've seen in the share prices of the likes of Somerset, maybe things have got a little bit overheated in the short term, but long term I still think they're very good assets to own.
Mark, would you have an update on the takeover front with the likes of A2 Milk and Kathmandu?
Yep, bit of a waiting game still with both of these. We saw an update from A2 Milk. They actually made their 2016 budgets clear for the market, so really just trying to keep shareholders informed. Growth looks pretty good in terms of what they're forecasting. Always a bit of risk with a company like this that they have to execute well, but looks reasonably positive in terms of reading that. They also said that they were talking to other parties, so they're clearly trying to shop the company around and try and extract hopefully another bidder that'll lead to a bit of price tension and deliver a better result. So there's more to come on that one, and likewise Kathmandu/Briscoes. We haven't seen a formal response from Kathmandu, so a little bit of a waiting game. We would expect a trading update over the next couple of weeks, and that could have an impact. The winter period's pretty important for a company like Kathmandu, especially when you think about how cold the weather's been. So if that's better than expected or worse than expected, it could sort of change the landscape there. But I think for investors, you just sit tight and you sort of wait for something to develop and wait for more information when you've got a bid on the table for both companies.
Yeah, I think with the Kathmandu bid, I think there's a couple of things to look at here, and whether their board will be comfortable with the amount of scrip component in the Briscoe bid. It's a very high scrip component, and the other factor I look at would be, and we mentioned before, the currency rate with the lower New Zealand dollar. How's that affecting both businesses? And that might also be a factor in terms of how they see the price of this offer.
And that's this week's edition of Market Talk. My thanks to Mark Lister of Craig's Investment Partners and NBR's Duncan Bridgman.
NBR Radio. Free to air online with business news you can use.
To drones, commercial drone operator Jared Wadhams was bemused to hear Transport Minister Simon Bridges' claim of enabling new operating rules. Mr Bridges announced the new rules in Christchurch at a function attended by Mr Wadhams, who operates Helicam Pro. Mr Bridges claims new rules for the use of unmanned aerial vehicles enable innovation and put New Zealand at the forefront of regulating a rapidly evolving industry. But Mr Wadhams says they will make his work extremely difficult and are likely to add hundreds of dollars to his quotes for business. Absent in the Minister's official news release was the main rule, which is found in the Civil Aviation Authority's news release. The requirement for operators who want to fly over people or property must gain consent from the affected individuals or property owners before they fly. This includes permission to fly over council-owned parks. Without this permission, an operator must seek CAA approval. Mr Wadhams says his work for real estate firms taking photographs of houses will be compromised because it often involves flying over several properties, which would break the rules, regardless of the oblique angle the craft's camera uses. He says additional paperwork will add to costs. Then there is the question of policing. Who will people complain to, Mr Wadhams asks. He says the Minister claimed the new rules were about safety, but that's difficult to accept in many cases. Mr Wadhams suspects the rules are more about privacy concerns, but CAA regulations cannot cover this issue. He says the Minister didn't give any practical ideas about how it will work in practice. And I can't see, he says, how this will regulate amateurs who buy a cheap one at a shop. I doubt they'll be aware of these rules, whereas it will affect commercial operators. The new rules for unmanned aircraft come into force next week. Operators must have a safety management plan. The main update to Rule Part 101, which was designed to regulate traditional model aircraft, is a requirement for operators who want to fly over people or property to gain consent from the affected individuals or property owners before they fly. Operators who intend to fly over public spaces will also need to get permission from the landowner, including councils. The CAA says we're encouraging public landowners to be proactive. This could involve erecting signs indicating if unmanned aircraft flights are allowed or not at a council park entrance. Those who cannot get consent from a landowner or individuals may still be able to operate if they obtain an operating certificate from the CAA under Rule Part 102. Civil Aviation Rule Part 102 requires anyone who wants to operate a drone at night, beyond line of sight or above 400 feet, to obtain certification from the Civil Aviation Authority. CAA says these changes strike a balance between safety and enabling operations. To the courts, Cameron Slater is facing a possible jail sentence for what businessman Matt Blomfield alleges is in contempt of court. The pair have been embroiled in court proceedings since Mr Blomfield launched an action claiming Mr Slater's whale oil blog posts defamed him by alleging he stole charitable funds, is a psychopath, makes pornography and deals drugs. He wanted Mr Slater to reveal sources for some of the allegations. The two appeared in the High Court at Auckland today for a separate case before Justice Raina Asher. Mr Blomfield is arguing his nemesis had breached undertakings to the court in multiple instances, so should be sent to jail for 6 weeks. The hearing was immediately sidetracked by the issue of whether Mark Spring should be allowed in the same room as Mr Blomfield because of a restraining order. Mr Blomfield said Mr Spring makes him nervous and is strange. His appeal was rejected, but the judge compromised by bringing in a police officer and a guard. Returning to the main matter, it was outlined Mr Slater had agreed to an informal undertaking not to publish material about Mr Blomfield unless it was already in the public domain. Mr Blomfield presented 25 articles that were published on the Whale Oil website, saying they were either defamatory or breaching the undertaking. The judge asked Mr Slater if he was content to proceed without legal representation. The blogger said his funds had been exhausted and was happy to proceed, saying Mr Blomfield's allegations were vexatious and fervent. Justice Asher then said contempt is a complex but serious crime and Mr Slater could lose his liberty and face jail time. The judge said the case depends on whether the alleged contempt is deemed current. Mr Blomfield argued that he had been notifying the court all the way through about the breaches and they are still current. The case continues.
This is NBR Radio on Thursday, July 23rd. I'm Owen Poland. Today's cut to New Zealand's official cash rate and the Reserve Bank's indication that more cuts are coming is good news for KiwiSaver portfolios, according to our reporter Jason Walls, who joins me in the studio. Jason, tell me more.
Well, it's quite interesting, actually, because the big distinction here is the cuts to the interest rate are going to be good for KiwiSaver, but bad for KiwiSavers, essentially. So, obviously, I'll start with the KiwiSavers part, because it's basically economics 101 when you get down to it. You have the interest rate cut means that you get paid less interest with your money at the bank.
And there's still a lot of money in our banks, isn't there?
Yeah.
On deposit.
Yeah, well, it would seem that way. So, essentially, so just say if the interest rate is 3%, you invest $100, you get $3 back. I'm very making this very simple, but just for argument's sake. And then, of course, when you bring it down, you get less. So there's a disincentive for savers here. And that's what's going to happen. We've got it down to 3, and as you mentioned in that intro, that the Reserve Bank is looking to continue to drop rates as well. In fact, I was talking to an economist, because this is where the big area of contention is here. It's how long, by how much they will drop and by how long. So the economist that I was talking to, Paul Dales from Capital Economics, said that they're actually going to get down to 2%. 2%, which is it's a huge drop from where we were currently at about 3.5, and we stayed there for about a year, down to 2. And he says that will means that we're going to drag the Kiwi dollar down to about 55 cents against the US, which is a massive drop as well, because we're currently at about 66%.
We'll start feeling like those Japanese housewives a long time ago when they had 0% for their savings, and they started snouting around for better forms of investment, which I guess is what happens. Yeah,
and that's what it leads very nicely into what the story is actually about. It's about KiwiSaver. Now, what the people I've been talking to say that this is actually going to be quite good for KiwiSaver portfolios, because a lot of the assets within these portfolios are invested overseas, because obviously you take your KiwiSaver and it gets invested into these companies, and these portfolio managers invested overseas to get better returns on your investment, And, of course, if the Kiwi dollar is depreciating, that means that the gains overseas are going to be a lot higher. In fact, there's something quite interesting that I saw, that although international equity markets have remained relatively flat in the aggregate in the last quarter, they rose 10.6% in New Zealand dollar terms. So that's great, especially if we've got so much money invested overseas within these KiwiSaver portfolios.
Now, you've been talking to Morningstar about this. What have they got to say?
I have. Well, basically, they were quite an interesting take on this. And they were saying that the Kiwi dollar was a key driver of performance for KiwiSaver investors during last quarter. So we see that it's going forward. We're going to see the Kiwi dollar continue to decrease in value over the last quarter. They've actually seen that the reduction in the Kiwi dollar has been something that's been driving them. In fact, I'll read you a quote here. This means currency positioning played a key role in and resulted in significant disparity in returns within each category, particularly in growth-focused categories. So that was Tim Murphy from Morningstar that said that. So, it's clear that the KiwiSaver is going to do quite well with the dropping New Zealand dollar. And as we know, when the Reserve Bank lowers interest rates, that brings the Kiwi dollar down.
And that's reporter Jason Walls.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett, partying since 1959. www.hoteldebret.com. NBR Radio.
This is NBR Radio on Thursday, July 23rd. I'm Owen Poland. It's common in large companies and organisations to carry out performance reviews. In my time at TVNZ, they were conducted every 6 months. In his editor's insight today, Neville Gibson says the practice is fast going out of favour among management, practitioners and experts, and I imagine many employees. Neville, why is the future for performance reviews looking so uncertain?
Well, the latest development is that the company that probably makes the most money out of management advice around the world and appraisal systems is dumping them itself. That's Accenture, which has 330,000 employees all around the world, including New Zealand, and it says it's going to end the practice in September. Their chief executive, Pierre Nanterme, he's been on television in the United States and in other platforms, says the firm has been preparing for what he calls this massive revolution in its internal operations for some time. And he says it is really going to get rid of 90% of what they did in the past. Instead, they're going to implement a much more fluid system for their employees, and they'll get timely feedback from their managers on a regular basis after each assignment and that sort of thing.
So what's the main criticism of these performance reviews?
Well, the critics say that the main problems include forced rankings. I'm not aware that this is too common in New Zealand, but it certainly is in the United States. There's all the time-consuming paperwork, of course, and then there's the frustration that you've alluded to among both the managers who have to carry it out and the employees as well. And the companies that have already dumped performance reviews say their own research plus that of outside studies convinced them that all the time, money and effort didn't really accomplish what the main aim of these things was, which was to get a better performance from their staff. Microsoft, for example, which was pretty big on rankings, a couple of years dropped the practice. They'd been preaching against in favour, rather, of judging employees against each other. They thought it was pretty good. And Deloitte, which is a bigger competitor of Accenture in New Zealand, says it's dropped the rankings and it's going to bring in an evaluation process that unfolds what they call incrementally throughout the year. And it's also experimenting with a short form, 4 simple questions, and a couple of those are yes or no answers.
Yeah, one of the bugbears for me was that you were urged to create goals for the future. And I always used to say to my manager, I just want to do my job professionally and effectively. So people are inclined to sort of make up certain goals to satisfy the process. What do the experts say about them?
Well, there's been research in the United States carried out by a company called CEB, and it found that 95% of managers were dissatisfied with the way their companies conducted performance reviews, and nearly 90% of the HR, human resources leaders, said their process didn't even give them accurate information. A couple of experts I looked at had similar views. Samuel Colbert of the Anderson School of Management at the University of California says they impede rather than promote personal growth, something you'd agree with. And they said inherently the subjectivity is often produces dishonest answers. And he says defenders of the review say, well, maybe it's just how they're being done. He says if only a cake is made with bad flour is more tasty than a crumb of bread made with the same flour. So he's saying it doesn't make any difference. And Jeffrey Pfeffer at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business, he's written quite a number of books, including one on this particular topic. He says they're inaccurate and are too infrequent to have any meaning and are often self-defeating. And he quotes a little saying about most people think they're above average, and I know that also applies to their driving abilities and quite a bit as well. But of course, if you're ranking people, no one or not everyone can be above average.
Exactly. Neville, time and cost will be saved if you're going to ditch this process, but surely staff performance needs to be measured in some way.
Well, that's right. Time and cost were certainly reasons that Accenture gave for their decision, but mainly because they thought the reviews weren't even producing the outcomes they required. And CEB ran some numbers on this, and they say that the big American companies spend more than 200 hours a year on these sort of activities, sitting in training sessions, filling out forms, using the technology often that comes with these sort of things, and then delivering the evaluations back to the employees. And when it was all added up, it said the average for a company employing about 10,000 people, probably not many employers do that, are that size in New Zealand, but that cost them $35 million a year. But it's what's likely to happen is switching to some new forms of and more responsive and flexible means. They probably won't be saving too much in the long run, but they'll certainly be getting more for their money.
I imagine there might be some human resources staff a bit anxious about their job security, but what will replace performance reviews, do you think?
Well, Accenture say that they are going to change to a measure of the value of the employees' contributions. Rather than doing it after the fact, they'll be aiming to give support to the workers so they perform better in future, so it's more going to be guiding forward. Professor Pfeffer's got some advice on that. He says that focusing on the individual may not be the answer. He says that team performance is a much better thing to do. He says a lot of companies' performances are often results in the variations they make to their work practices and their systems rather than the contribution of individuals. And he says looking at these sort of things which may involve inferior technology, that sort of thing, may be better. Meanwhile, Accenture's Mr. Nanterm says that leadership's not really about your time spent measuring and evaluating your staff. It's about selecting the right person and then letting them get on with it.
Hallelujah. That's today's Editor's Insight with Neville Gibson.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
In market news, Livestock Improvement Corp, a farmer co-op that sells bull semen and manages a dairy genetics database, posted its third straight drop in annual profit as lower milk prices weighed on demand for its services, and it spent more on technology and infrastructure to be able to deliver new products to farmers. The co-op said net profit dropped to $13.7 million in the year through May from $18 million in 2014, $23.7 million in 2013 and $24.4 million in 2012. In the latest year, it said total revenue rose 10% to $232 million, while revenue from ordinary activities rose 10% to $228.4 million. Livestock Improvement aims to lift annual revenue to $1 billion by 2025 through growing its existing business, launching new products, acquisitions and growth offshore of its Minder Herd Record Service, ProTrack Farm Automation Solutions and its Dairy Automation Milk Testing Sensors. The co-op had earlier warned that increased spending, combined with this season's much reduced milk payout, meant annual profit would decline. Chairman Murray King said in a letter to farmer shareholders, the latest result is in line with forecasts made in 2014 as part of the expected impact of the lower milk payout and the co-op's long-term capital investment program. The co-op increased its research and development spending by 13% to $16.9 million in the past year, which equates to 7.4% of revenue, up from 7.2% of revenue the year earlier. It invested in research to improve the accuracy of genomic predictions, a new John's disease breeding value estimate and investigations into new technology to measure pasture covers, potential new animal health diagnostics tests and automated body condition scoring. It spent $48 million on capital investment in the year, with $28 million for technology upgrades and new product developments. That included a new $5 million herd testing centre in Hamilton, renovation and refurbishment of offices to meet growth demands, semen laboratory upgrades and a new semen collection barn. Over the past year, the co-op has entered a research and development partnership with Dutch agricultural company Lely Group, whose local unit designed sensors for animal health and production, and entered into a deal with Cow Intelligence Company, or SCR Dairy, to distribute its technology into new regions, including Belarus, Israel, Russia and Turkey. In December, LIC acquired a majority stake and exclusive supply to its Brazilian genetics distributor. Strategic growth decisions yet to be made include whether to enter the Chinese market. Since its May 31st balance date, the co-op has entered into a new $125 million syndicated banking facility. It has previously said it's likely to require $140 million in equity capital over the next 10 years to meet its growth goals. It had cash and equivalents of $2.5 million at May 31st, down from $15.5 million a year earlier. In market news, New Zealand accounting software pioneer Xero expects to double global revenue to more than $200 million in the year to March 2016, based on current exchange rates, having taken 8 years since listing on the NZX in June 2007 to reach its first $100 million. However, Chief Executive Rod Drury told the annual meeting in Wellington it's in no rush to fulfill its intention to list on the US Stock Exchange before the release of the results for the next year. He said the company remained well funded with $269 million on hand from earlier capital raisings, a key factor in Xero's capacity to pursue rapid growth at the expense of less cashed-up competitors in the key Australian, US and UK markets. Total billings in the last financial year were $121 million, up from $67 million in the year to March 2014. Effervescent as ever, Mr Drury had to ask the classically reserved audience of around 200 New Zealand shareholders to applaud for the company's achievements after a year in which the challenges of executing its growth strategy in the US market saw Xero stumble a couple of times, including 2 misfires on senior executive appointments. Over the last year, the company's share price has fallen 26%, although it closed yesterday up 2.3% at $17.95. The company's not projecting early profitability, seeking global scale in the belief that profits will be greater in the long run. The new US chief executive, Ross Fujioka, a US tech industry veteran of 30 years with a big background at Dell and Adobe, told a story of rapidly spiralling customer uptake, growing at 94% year-on-year growth rates, with 35,000 customers now in the US, half of whom have arrived in the last 8 months, with nearly half signing up online. Re-elected US-based company director Craig Elliott told the meeting that in his 3 years on the board, he'd gone from having to explain what Xero is to having people ask him about Xero. He said enthusiasm about the business in the US is growing by the day. New Zealand Managing Director Victoria Crone announced the company had just passed the 150,000 subscriber mark in New Zealand with a 35% customer growth rate. In Australia, customers stand at 203,000 and are growing at an annual rate of 86%. Mr Drury said only 7% of all software as a service business ever achieved more than 10,000 users, and Xero's scale and willingness to partner with providers of new solutions was creating a breeding ground for smaller software companies in New Zealand and internationally. Xero's Chief Marketing Officer, Andy Lark, said the business was now generating substantial network effects, the new source of growth for online businesses after the social networks growth that drove the last 10 years. He pointed to organic growth already occurring in untargeted markets, including South Africa, Indonesia and Brazil. Mr Drury said the drop in the New Zealand dollar was not a major factor in the $200 million turnover forecast because the company earned revenue in a variety of currencies, with $74.2 million of the company's annualised committed monthly revenue of $159.3 million generated in Australia and $39.5 million in New Zealand. That compares with North America monthly revenues of $12.5. The UK market, where the company is also making a concerted push, accounts for $25.9 million a month on current customer numbers. Mr Drury said, "I wish we'd kept all the money we raised in US dollars, but that wasn't our Treasury policy." He said, reflecting on a 25% fall in the New Zealand dollar exchange rate against the US dollar in the last year, during which the company raised a total of $147.2 million from 2 US private equity investment funds. Let's talk housing policy. Another former Reserve Bank official says the available evidence doesn't support the central bank's housing market policies. Ian Harrison, who's also worked for the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Bank for International Settlements, is now a consultant. In a paper reviewing the Reserve Bank's plans to impose new restrictions on bank lending to property investors from October, Mr Harrison says the central bank's arguments are either wrong, trivial, or convey a lack of understanding of relevant banking practices and the New Zealand legal environment. Mr Harrison's trenchant criticism matches that of Michael Riddell, formerly a senior economics advisor at the central bank, who was made redundant in April. He says the bank has primarily relied on overseas evidence to support its claim that residential investor mortgages are riskier than other mortgages. But the paper says the available studies for other loan attributes found investor status had no impact or only a trivial impact on default rates. None of the other references the bank cites provide substantive support for its conclusions. Furthermore, Mr Harrison says banking practices and the relevant laws in the countries the Reserve Bank is focused on are so different from New Zealand's that few lessons can be drawn from them. For example, New Zealand banks don't sell subprime mortgages as US banks did before the global financial crisis. And the central bank is wrong to ignore the New Zealand evidence which shows that investor loans aren't riskier. He says some might say this is all irrelevant and is just a case of economists bickering about the numbers. Something has to be done about Auckland house prices, and if the bank has had to gild the lily on the evidence, impose significant costs on banks and distort the way they measure the risks, so be it. But bad analysis, Mr Harrison says, seldom leads to good policy outcomes. Most investor loans are to small investors who typically own their own homes and have one or two investment properties, and the banks already distinguish between them and loans to professional investors. Mr Harrison says studies the Reserve Bank should have reviewed, but which it hasn't cited, show no material difference between investor loans and other mortgages. In fact, he suggests retail investors with one or two properties are probably a less risky proposition than those who only own their own homes because their incomes are more diverse. They generally have both labour income and rental income. He says the Reserve Bank's arguments supporting its policies contain material omission. For example, in citing a paper by the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, the Reserve Bank omitted a key paragraph, Mr Harrison says. The paragraph read, APRA has indicated that there has not been a material difference in the performance of owner-occupied versus non-owner-occupied residential mortgages in recent history, even between 2008 and 9, which was a period of higher default experience. Mr Harrison says, as Jeremy Clarkson might put it, some say that the bank believes leprechauns are real and that King Canute rolled back the sea. All we know, it's bad analysis.
NBR Radio with Baileys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
This is NBR Radio on Thursday, July 23rd. I'm Owen Poland. Well, the Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler this morning cut the official cash rate from 3.25 to 3%. No surprises there, and he indicated further cuts are on the way. Joining me for more detail on today's announcement is Rob Hosking. Rob?
Yeah, very interesting statement, I thought, because, as you say, the 25-point cut was expected. The question was always going to be what the next move is. There were some people pushing for a 0.5% cut. That, to me, always looked to be not a very good option for a number of reasons. I think it would have looked like panic, and instead of actually bolstering confidence, I think it would have had the opposite effect. The interesting thing from here, I think, is or the question that hangs over today's statement is this a signal that he's going to cut interest rates a little bit further than he signalled back in June when he started cutting, or is he simply front-loading them a bit more? Because back when we had the June statement, which was unlike today, it was a full monetary policy statement, so it had updated forecasts. This was just a very short statement, and we get the next set of forecasts in another 6 weeks. But back then, the signal was that GDP growth was still, despite the dairy downturn, expected to hold up reasonably well at around an average of 3% annually over the next 3 years. Now, they said quite explicitly today that now looks over-optimistic. And the other thing that's changed since then is the outlook for the dollar, which is quite a bit lower already than what was forecast back in June. We're about 7% on a trade-weighted index basis below what their forecast was for it to average over the entire quarter. We've reached that point already. And
the governor said a key uncertainty is how quickly the exchange rate will pass through.
Yes, or even if it does. This is the great unknown, because normally when you get an exchange rate fall like the one we've had, and against the US dollar, the New Zealand dollar has fallen 25% since last June. That is a hell of a drop, and yet it has not flown into inflation at all. Now, some of that is because of the drop in the oil price, but it's not all because of that. Some of it is simply that people are not passing on their costs, and they don't feel they have been able to. And if the local economy is slowing a little bit more, as it seems to be, then firms are going to be having a real margin squeeze. They're going to feel even less able to pass on those costs. And I think that's the reason why I think the last, the widest ranging business mood survey, the NZIER one, showed retailers the most pessimistic sector of all, because if you look at what's happened, they're facing higher costs even before the more recent fall in the exchange rate, yet they're not expecting to put up their prices, and they're facing a real squeeze, particularly in the dairy regions. It was quite noticeable there. So I think the question now is how big a slowdown we're looking at, and how much the fall in the exchange rate is going to keep going, and how much that's going to cushion the drop in the dairy price and those other factors. Now, if local firms are not able to see that price adjustment flow through, then I think we're going to be in a rather odd situation where effectively we are going to see some quite a shutdown in activity by firms. We're probably going to see some firms go to the wall. We're certainly going to see, of course, some of the more marginal indebted dairy farmers have to sell up. Now, the land is probably not going to drop much in price. Any shift in that activity is not going to, for those dairy farmers who are affected by that, you're probably not going to see a major drop in economic activity overall, because other people are going to move into there. But it could potentially be ugly, and these are all things that the Reserve Bank's having to juggle there. Now, I think the hope is that by lowering interest rates, they're going to take some of the pressure off those dairy farmers. The question is whether retail banks will, how indulgent they're going to feel. And implicitly, by cutting the OCR today, the Reserve Bank's giving them a bit of a nudge to effectively help some of those more marginal farmers farm their way through.
And of course, there's a few economists out there, Rob, forecasting OCR cuts below 2.5%, but you're not necessarily buying into that line of thinking.
No. Look, that could happen, and look, I think at the moment, I think no one knows, and I don't think the Reserve Bank knows. And so much, again, it swings on that exchange rate, because if that lower exchange rate does start feeding through into inflation a little bit more, then the Reserve Bank probably is not going to cut things deeper. The big question, really, to put it simply, is the Reserve Bank front-loading the interest rate cuts a little bit more, or is it going to cut deeper? So is it simply bringing forward the cuts that it planned to do when it started easing back in June? Because back then, it was expected that there'd be 2 cuts, possibly a third, and that they would be gradual. So we'd have that one in June, probably one in September, maybe one in December. And it's now, of course, we're now in July. They brought at least one of those forward. And so this is the real question, really. And I don't think the Reserve Bank itself knows the answer to it.
Always a fascinating juggling act, Rob. That's Rob Hosking.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
I'm Grant Walker with Last Call. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. Bill English says lines companies' values are at risk. New drone rules. If you're in a retirement village, then you're pretty happy. Australia wants new country of origin labelling, and could Cameron Slater go to jail? To find out more on our stories, just log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. Let's talk migrant workers. The Garden City is poised to receive more migrant workers, despite experts saying the rebuild spend has peaked. Last week, figures from Westpac revealed the spend on the Canterbury rebuild, which has contributed to a significant boost to GDP and employment, has plateaued. The report says although there is still a large amount of work to be completed, there is no longer an expectation of big increases in construction activity in Canterbury. It says construction will continue at current strong levels over the next year or so and will start to gradually wind down from about the middle of next year. One World Resourcing Chief Executive, Declan Clancy, says he does not expect demand for migrant workers to reduce significantly in the short to medium term. In fact, Mr Clancy says demand for migrant workers is likely to increase as more major rebuild projects get underway. He says some companies will delay hiring migrant workers until they know what share of future rebuild work they're likely to have. Mr Clancy says as these contracts are awarded, we will see these companies turn to agencies such as ours to help them find the workers they will need to get the work done. Since July 2011, almost 5,500 work visas for the Canterbury rebuild have been issued for migrant workers. Westpac senior economist Satish Ranchod says he sees a positive outlook for construction for other parts of the country, particularly in Auckland. Mr Ranchod says with Auckland construction offsets in place, it's going to be a period of adjustment for the economy after the big boost starts to fade. He says there will be questions around how we allocate resources and how quickly people can migrate between those different regions where the jobs are. Figures from Robert Walters suggest more employers nationwide are looking to increase their headcount over the next 6 months. Robert Walters director Shay Peters says 9 out of 10 organisations are looking to retain or increase headcount for the second half of 2015. He says these results are a reflection of confidence in the New Zealand economy. Mr Peters says this is further reinforced by the very small number looking to downsize, a marked reduction over the past 24 months. Some 61% of hiring managers say their focus for the next 6 months will be on permanent employees, up on 2014 figures where only 47% said the same. To the energy sector, Finance Minister Bill English says the value of electricity lines companies is in danger of being eroded by technological developments and because they are largely community-owned. There's too much complacency among the community-owned lines companies, Mr English told a Commerce Commission conference on competition matters. The cost of the distributed generation of electricity has dropped very fast and that process will continue. Mr English said community-owned lines companies now represent a significant commercial risk. That's not quite how they see their role, but the risk relates to both economic efficiency and the destruction of community wealth. Mr English said the government knows about this because the government owns a lot of assets threatened by technology advances. For example, its free-to-air broadcasting assets used to be worth $1 billion, but now are worth $300 million. He said it's not hard to imagine that before too long they're going to be relics of a bygone age. Because of the pressure to keep broadcasting assets in government ownership, the government has had to stand by and watch their value being destroyed. A similar process has slashed the value of New Zealand Post. Mr English said that could happen with our lines companies. He says the government is currently looking at water assets and whether they're efficient in responding to competitive pressures. He said a number of operators of our free water system simply don't have the data. They don't need to know whether they are run well or not. Mr English said community ownership may allow the community to capture any excess profits from being a monopoly, but it certainly hasn't promoted efficiency in the management of a very large asset class, one of the largest in New Zealand. The Finance Minister suggested floating such assets may be the answer, without explicitly saying so. Mr English said the government is now getting twice as much in dividends from the 3 electricity generators and retailers it sold down over the last couple of years than when it had full ownership. Mr English said a 100% ownership in a competitive market dulls the competitive signals. Previously, those 3 companies hadn't been efficient users of capital and their cost structures were too high. He said bringing in private shareholders and listing those companies on NZX meant market forces solved these problems. In market news, Briscoe Group's formal takeover offer for Kathmandu is due to be mailed to shareholders tomorrow after the takeovers panel granted a necessary waiver on Wednesday. The documentation is expected to be with shareholders by Monday. The homeware and sports retailer announced its intention to make an offer for Kathmandu on June 30, indicating it would pay a combination of cash and scrip with a value of about $180 a share. The structure of the offer meant Briscoe needed a waiver from the takeovers panel because overseas shareholders could not be paid in shares. Briscoe proposed to pay the shares to a trustee who would sell them and pass the cash to overseas shareholders. The takeover's code requires all shareholders to be treated the same, so the differential treatment for overseas shareholders required a waiver from the panel. Briscoe Group Managing Director Rod Duke said the takeover offer documentation will be mailed out tomorrow, being Friday, so it should be with everyone by the opening of business Monday. The takeover terms offer Kathmandu shareholders 5 Briscoe shares for every 9 Kathmandu shares they own, plus 20 cents per Kathmandu share. At the current Briscoe share price of $2.80, the offer has a value of about $1.76 a share. In its forthcoming results, with Kathmandu's improving performance, she said the offer from Briscoe looked too low. She said, in our view, BGR's current offer does not include any control premium, nor take into account any synergies that it must be incorporating as part of its proposed offer. As such, it would be not any deal across the line. Briscoe is being advised on the takeover by Macquarie, while Goldman Sachs is advising Kathmandu.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
Let's talk rates. Rates campaigner David Thornton wants local government minister Paula Bennett to look at scrapping council rates and replacing them with a property value tax, or PVT, where increases are limited to 2% a year. The former North Shore councillor has written to Ms Bennett asking her to investigate his proposal, in which annual tax charges would be by way of a transparent percentage based on the new PVT. Changes in value would only occur on sale of the property or additional building which adds value. He says real estate agents would not be able to use the new PVT as an indication of market value, which is the current and often misleading practice. Mr Thornton, who founded lobby group No More Rates, says Aucklanders angry at huge rates increases need to look deeper than simply blaming council spending and waste, although both do impact hugely. He says the killer in this year's wide variation in rates bills is the general property revaluation that took effect at the beginning of the month. Added to this is the financial year of converting to a single rating system across the whole of the supercity, he says, plus the transport levy imposed as a fixed charge. In another 3 years, he says, there will be another property revaluation, which will inevitably bring wild variations in rates bills again. Only a change in the valuation process will stop this continuing 3-yearly fluctuation, bringing anguish and concern to residential ratepayers. His proposal is based on Proposition 13, introduced by California in 1978. It survived despite many attempts to change it. Mr Thornton says since 1978, more than half of all states in the US have introduced similar systems aimed at giving residents some meaningful control over local government taxation and expenditure. To the courts, Sir Robert Jones Property Company has failed to put on ice in order to file affidavits in opposition to clawback demands from a liquidator of a failed blue-chip company. Liquidators for former blue-chip company Northern Crest have identified $750,000 in payments made to Robert Jones Holdings they say should be returned to the liquidators' pool. In February, Robert Jones Holdings lawyer Damien Chesterman said liquidators were cherry-picking which evidence they showed Robert Jones Holdings, and the company needs to see everything to prepare its case. Mr Chesterman told the High Court at Auckland that this was not a typical commercial case due to the actions of former blue-chip boss Mark Bryars, whose property management business failed in 2008, owing investors more than $84 million. The NBR Rich Listers property firm had leased part of an office building in Auckland's Queen Street to Northern Crest, but Northern Crest had abandoned the lease before it expired. Last month, Associate Judge Roger Bell dismissed the company's application for further discovery and to challenge privilege on some evidence. He also ordered Robert Jones Holdings to file and serve affidavits in opposition to the substantive voidable transaction proceeding, which is expected to take 5 to 10 days by August 14. Robert Jones Holding has filed an application for review of this decision. Today, the matter returned to the High Court at Auckland before Justice Sarah Katz, where Robert Jones Holding sought timetabling for the review and asked the August 14 order be extended until after the review was resolved. Mr Chesterman wants to argue that the payments, which were not made by Northern Crest but by Mark Bryars' link company Columbus, were a gift. His alternative defence is that Northern Crest was solvent when it made the payment, so the clawback payment provisions do not apply. Mr Chesterman says Associate Judge Bell's decision went outside its jurisdiction in dismissing Robert Jones Holdings' defences to the substantive claim. As such, it cannot file its expert evidence by August 14 because the judge cut right through the expert's evidence, meaning the review needs to be heard before it should file its evidence. But the lawyer for the liquidators, Brian Keane QC, says the application is now 2 years on with little substantive progress. He says the liquidators have limited resources, while Robert Jones Holdings is a well-resourced corporation and the matter needs to be brought to a finality. He says we require evidence and documents, and that should be clear so that we know where we're going. This has got to stop and we've got to move forward. Justice Katz dismissed the application to have the August 14 order put on ice and ordered the review hearing be allocated one day at the first date after August 30. To the OCR, Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler this morning cut the official cash rate from 3.25% to 3% and indicated further cuts are on the way. Mr Wheeler says at this point some further easing seems likely. At the time of the last full monetary policy statement 6 weeks ago, the Reserve Bank expected average annual GDP growth of about 3% for the next 3 years. Today's statement did not include updated forecasts. These come with the next full monetary policy statement on September 10, but Mr Wheeler says the outlook is softer than it was in June. He says New Zealand's economy is currently growing at an annual rate of around 2.5%, supported by low interest rates, construction activity and high net immigration. However, the Canterbury reconstruction appears to have peaked and the world price for New Zealand's dairy exports has fallen sharply. Annual CPI inflation is expected to be close to the midpoint of the range in early 2016 due to recent exchange rate depreciation and as the decline in oil price drops out of the annual figure. A key uncertainty is how quickly the exchange rate pass-through will occur, he says. This comment and others related to inflation make today's statement a highly contingent and almost ambiguous one. On the one hand, the Reserve Bank is hinting at the probability of further interest rate cuts than was signalled in June. The June statement, by way of its forecasts for 90-day interest rates, implied 2 more OCR cuts following the June cut. At the time, it appeared those cuts would be gradual. The second cut in September and perhaps one at the October or December reviews appeared possible. The run of less than stellar economic data brought those cuts forward. However, the comments on inflation and the New Zealand dollar in today's statement did not necessarily mean those economists forecasting OCR cuts below 2.5% are right. How much the New Zealand dollar's fall translates into higher import prices is the key thing here. Mr Wheeler is now saying the price inflation is now expected to be close to the midpoint of the 1 to 3% range by early next year due to both the drop in the currency and as the decline in oil prices drops out of the annual figure. The June forecasts did not have the CPI reaching the midpoint until the final quarter of 2016. Much will depend on how far businesses can pass on the cost of higher imports. The recent New Zealand Institute of Economic Research quarterly survey of business opinion indicates retailers have not been able to pass on recent falls. A softening economic outlook will make it even more difficult for them and other businesses to do so.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
To Australia, not content with already contentious and expensive food labelling requirements, the Australian government is proposing new ways to let consumers know what they're eating. Prompted by a hepatitis scare this year linked to frozen berries imported from China, a raft of changes has been proposed to Australian-made requirements. This will indicate the proportion of a packed or processed food item is Australian by changes to the green and gold kangaroo logo. A gold bar or ruler below the triangular Australian-made logo will show whether local ingredients make up less than 25%, more than 50%, more than 75% or 100% of the final product. The changes were announced by Prime Minister Tony Abbott, Agriculture Minister Barnaby Joyce and Industry Minister Ian Macfarlane. Mr Abbott says it's really a very simple and straightforward initiative which is designed to ensure that people right around the world know that what they are buying is Australian. This is really important, and this is something that the Australian public has wanted for a long time. The labels will initially be voluntary, but manufacturers will be forced to use them from next year if the states and territories agree to the proposal. Unlike some demands for country of origin labelling, this proposal doesn't require the foreign source of the item to be identified, except if packed locally. Naturally, this has drawn disapproval from consumer groups such as Choice, which wants this to be mandatory for all food. Spokesman Tom Godfrey says those consumers who want to know where their food comes from will still be left wondering which of the 195 countries from around the world their dinner comes from. If such a disclosure is made, it will appear below the Australian-made logo. Any disclosure would appear in clear text and say, for example, made in Australia from Australian and French peas or made in Australia from Canadian pork. How much of the product was French or Canadian would be conveyed to consumers by the shade of gold on the ruler. Other labelling options proposed by the government would indicate whether a product had been grown in or packed in Australia. However, goods packed in Australia but made elsewhere would be required to identify the country of origin on their packaging. Such disclosures might say, for example, packed in Australia, made in Canada, or packed in Australia, grown in France. Mr Abbott says the cost to Australian businesses is estimated at $37 million a year, while Mr Joyce says flow-on costs for consumers would be an extra 1 cent for every $5 spent. In addition to country of origin labelling, food companies are also moving to a new star-based system to indicate the nutritional value of their products. To the dollar. The New Zealand dollar jumped more than half a US cent after Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler cut the OCR by a quarter point and said the currency needs to be lower while dropping a reference to criteria that justified intervention. The Kiwi rose as high as 66.47 US from 65.78 immediately before the release, and was recently trading at 66.41. Mr Wheeler lowered the OCR by 25 basis points to 3% due to the softening in the economic outlook and low inflation, largely meeting market expectations, which had priced in an outside chance of a deeper cut and said more easing was likely. He dropped his reference to the New Zealand dollar being unjustifiably and unsustainably high, criteria which warrant intervention, while saying its significant decline since April and lower interest rates have led to easier monetary conditions. The Reserve Bank had reiterated the currency was at unjustifiable and unsustainable levels in its statement of corporate intent released last month, having removed the reference in the June 11 monetary policy statement. Mr Wheeler said while the currency depreciation will provide support to the export and import competing sectors, further depreciation is necessary given the weakness in export commodity prices. Westpac Banking Corp market strategist Imre Speiser said the guidance wasn't strong enough and the currency warning was arguably watered down a bit. BK Asset Management Managing Director Kathy Lean said in a note the removal of that guidance suggests the next cut won't be at the September meeting, though any gains in the currency should be capped due to the easing bias. Still, ASB Bank Chief Economist Nick Tuffley said while foreign exchange markets may make a lot out of the changed guidance on the currency, the key message from the RBNZ is it wants to see the New Zealand dollar lower in the wake of yet further dairy price declines. Mr Wheeler kicked off an easing cycle last month as inflation stayed below his target band and falling dairy prices led to a deterioration in the country's terms of trade, forecasting the 90-day bank bill rate, often seen as a proxy for the OCR, would fall to 3.3% in the December quarter before bottoming out at 3.1% in June 2016. At the time, he told politicians he was watching a number of indicators, including inflation signals, commodity prices, and the falling currency, engaging whether to cut interest rates again. Government data last week showed New Zealand's Consumers Price Index rose at an annual pace of 0.3%, and Mr Wheeler said the headline rate was tracking below the bank's 1 to 3% target band, due largely to previous strength in the New Zealand dollar and a large decline in world oil prices. Non-tradable inflation, which covers the domestic sector, increased at an annual 2% pace in the period, its lowest level since December 2001. Mr Wheeler said the bank expects the annual CPI to rise to around 2%, its target midpoint of the range early next year, though a key uncertainty is how quickly the exchange rate pass-through will occur. The Reserve Bank has been juggling the competing tensions of a strong dollar eroding export receipts against rapid house price gains in Auckland. It settled on imposing new lending restrictions on property investment loans as a means to try and cool the housing market from October. Two banks, ANZ Bank New Zealand and Kiwi Bank, immediately announced mortgage interest rate cuts. ANZ will cut the rates on its floating and fixed ANZ's flexible home loans by 0.25% per annum to 6.24 and 6.35 respectively, with the new floating rate applying for new customers from July 27 and for all existing floating and fixed rate customers from August 10. Kiwi Bank said it would immediately cut floating and revolving credit mortgage rates by 25 basis points, down from 6.4 to 6.15 for new customers, with existing customers getting the cut in a fortnight. To the economy. According to Finance Minister Bill English, light regulation in the New Zealand dairy industry has insulated the wider economy from the sharp decline in prices for the country's largest export commodity. Prices for whole milk powder, the country's key commodity export, have plunged this year and dropped an unexpectedly large 10.7% in the GDT auction last week, sending the Kiwi dollar to 6-year lows. Dairy prices are now expected to remain lower for longer than previously forecast amid higher global supplies, weak demand in China, and an import ban in Russia on European dairy products which are being sold into other markets. Speaking at the Commerce Commission's annual conference in Wellington, Mr English said sound regulation had built a more resilient economy and pointed to the dairy price shock as an example. He told the Competition Matters 2015 conference, "I don't think there is much doubt in the past decades when New Zealand was more regulated, a price shock to the extent of the current change in milk prices would have paralysed this economy. In fact, we saw that in the late 1980s and early 90s in the agricultural sector when price subsidies were removed. A price shock in that case because of a policy decision. That paralysed communities and changed them quite dramatically because they lacked the resilience that goes with moving with the market and being subject to the competitive forces day to day, week to week. The weaker prices come as local production is rising heading into the country's peak supply period in October. Fonterra is expecting to lower its forecast payout to farmers for this season following its board meeting next month. The Auckland-based company currently forecasts a payout of $5.25 per kilogram of milk solids for the current 2015-16 season, from $4.40 last season and a record $8.40 the previous season. Economists expect a payout of between $3.75 to $5 for this season, while Dairy New Zealand estimates $5.70 is the industry average break-even point for most farmers. Mr English didn't detail the economic outlook, saying he would leave that to the Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler, who cut the OCR 25 basis points to 3% this morning. Mr Wheeler kicked off an easing cycle last month as inflation stayed below his target band and falling dairy prices led to a deterioration in the country's terms of trade. Today, the governor said a lower Kiwi dollar is needed to prop up the nation's export sector. The central bank has said a second year of low payouts would be a concern for the New Zealand economy, especially for some 25% of dairy farmers currently trading with negative cash flow.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant, an unparalleled private dining room choice. NBR Radio.
In employment news, Fidelity Life is cutting its IT staff from 59 to around 30. Chief Executive Milton Jennings told NBR Radio that 9 contractors will not see their contracts renewed and about 10 permanent staff will lose their jobs. Fidelity bought Towers Life Insurance business for $189 million in late 2013. Mr Jennings says IT staff were expanded from 50 to 70 at the time of the acquisition, specifically to manage the merger of the two businesses' IT systems. With that project wrapping up, the team will be shrunk. He says 90% of Tower policies have now been loaded onto Fidelity's system. The project shall be finished by the end of this month. The chief executive says communication was not as good as it could have been. Some of those people thought they were carrying on, but it was never the intention. Let's talk UFB. Finance Minister Bill English says the government doesn't want to spend any more money or stay any longer in the build of New Zealand's ultra-fast broadband network for fear it might stuff it up. The government wants to extend the UFB program to 80% of the nation's population from its original 75% target, and has also expressed a desire to extend the rural initiative and improve mobile coverage as well. Speaking of the annual Commerce Commission Competition Matters 2015 conference in Wellington, Mr English said that while the government-subsidised rollout of broadband across the country was being executed competently, the Crown was keenly aware of how extended involvement in the telecommunications sector could distort the value of the initiative. Mr English told the conference, "We do not want the government to remain long-term as a significant influence and participant in the telecommunications sector because it will stuff it up. We're fully aware of the potential distortionary impact of significant government role in the telecommunications sector, and certainly this government will be keen to withdraw as quickly and effectively as it can." Chorus, which has been tasked with the job of building the bulk of the UFB infrastructure, has been battling the antitrust regulator since the Commission slashed the amount the company could charge service providers to use its copper lines, which the network operator says put a hole in its budget for building the fibre network. In July last year, Chorus cut a deal with Crown Fibre Holdings, the government body overseeing the UFB rollout, to bring forward funding of $178 million, though at a high interest rate and at the expense of dividends. That came after Crown Fibre gave Chorus greater flexibility in building the network, provided it meets an agreed deadline. Mr English said government spending made the UFB appear attractive because people thought they were getting something for nothing, but he wasn't signalling that there would be an early transfer of the Crown's interest in the network. He said by 2019, when the contract ends, we're right out of there. If you see any signs of government digging in or people wanting to draw us in further, please stop them, because you'll spend 15 years undoing the damage. The regulatory uncertainty around Chorus saw its share price slump more than 75% in just over a year, from its high of $3.70 before the Commission's copper lines changes in November 2012, to a low of $127.5 in late 2013. The stock fell 1.2% to $283 in afternoon trading today. In People News, the Serious Fraud Office has laid 39 Crimes Act and Serious Fraud Office Act charges against Mark Ivell in the Tauranga District Court relating to $4.28 million he obtained in a period spanning 1990 to 2014. The 58-year-old faces 21 charges of obtaining by deception, 14 charges of obtaining by false pretense, 2 charges of using a forged document and 2 charges of obstructing an investigation. The SFO alleges Ivell survived financially since the early 1990s by receiving cash and direct credit payments from a number of people who were expecting returns on a claimed property development in Australia and other schemes. The SFO has also laid charges in relation to Mr Ivell's failure to appear at an interview with its investigators and failure to provide documents it required during the investigation. No plea was entered. Director Julie Reid said Ivell has a reputation for being elusive and using aliases, including the names Mark Irvine and Mark Irvine. This could potentially mean there are more victims. We encourage anyone who's concerned about their dealings with Mr Ivell to contact the SFO. Complaints were made regarding his affairs to the SFO in June last year. He'll next appear in the Tauranga District Court on July 28.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
In market news, Xero is postponing a United States float for at least another year, with founder Rod Drury admitting his company needs to prove it can make it in that market first. He said, "I think we have to demonstrate traction in the US." Last year, Mr Drury was saying passing the 100 million revenue mark would be sufficient to give Xero credibility in that market. After exceeding that target in the year ended March, he's now promising the company will pass 200 million this year. After yesterday's annual shareholders meeting, Mr Drury said other reasons for delaying Xero US listing are the markets are all over the place at the moment. We want to get our leadership team locked in. Last year, the company hit a major snag when it decided its North American head, Peter Karpus, was the wrong person for the job after just 6 months. Mr Karpus, who formerly worked for PayPal, had been touted as a key person to drive Xero's battle with giant US accounting software firm Intuit. And then its US-based Chief Financial Officer, Douglas Jeffries, left Xero in April this year after just 2 months, having apparently failed to realise when he took on the job how much he would have to travel. The company has appointed Russell Fujioka, who previously worked for Dell and Adobe, as US President, and Andy Lark, previously Commonwealth Bank of Australia's Marketing Manager, as its Chief Marketing Manager. Plus, Sankar Narayan, previously Chief Financial Officer at Virgin Australia, Fairfax and Foxtel, who was a computer engineer who worked in Silicon Valley for 8 years, will take up the top finance role in October. Mr Fujioka told shareholders Xero is starting to gain traction in the US, where it's operated for 3 years, having gained half its 35,000 customers there in the past 8 months. He said he hopes to return to next year's meeting with a much better set of numbers. Mr Drury says the board will reassess whether conditions are right for a US float after March next year. But he says having raised a further $147.2 million in February, taking cash to $268.9 million at the end of March, gives Xero the luxury of being able to execute its plans regardless of market conditions. Let's talk retirement. The head of the Retirement Village Association says perceptions of retirement villages are changing as increasingly better facilities bump up resident satisfaction levels. Executive Director John Collins told NBR Radio, "We all know that the numbers of over 75-year-olds are increasing, but what's particularly important for us is the percentage of this age group choosing to live in retirement villages is also increasing." A resident survey commissioned by the association gives the sector a net promoter score of 47, which Mr Collins says is one of the highest scored for an industry, as anything above 0 is considered good. The research also shows residents in New Zealand are almost twice as satisfied with retirement village living as their Australian counterparts. Mr Collins says demand is increasing as village residents recommend the benefits of living in a retirement village, including security, companionship and releasing equity from a home to friends and family. He says, "Since I first started with the association almost 8 years ago, the number of over 75s living in a retirement village has doubled. What's happened is retirement villages have gone from a fringe option to something considered a mainstream housing option for our older people. This bodes well for the sector as growth in this age group will fuel demand and there's plenty of room for expansion." New research from JLL shows the growth within the over 75 age group is forecast to grow at a greater rate than the over 65 age group, reflecting that not only does New Zealand have an ageing population, but also that this demographic is likely to live longer than previous generations. The over 75 age group has projected growth of 193% from 2013 to 2043, while the proportion of the population within this age group is forecast to increase from 6% in 2013 to 14% in 2043. Based on Stats New Zealand's median population projections, there is a demand for 13.6 new villages a year between 2013 and 2043. Last year, there was clear growth in village numbers across every region with the exception of the West Coast. At the end of 2014, there were 363 villages operating in New Zealand, an increase of 12 from 2013. Of these, 75 were located in Auckland, 66 in Canterbury and 39 in the Bay of Plenty. To Parliament, New Zealand First's unconstitutional anti-ISDS bill was narrowly voted down yesterday after its first reading. The Fighting Foreign Corporate Control 2015 bill was introduced in March to prohibit New Zealand from entering into any trade agreement that includes provisions for investor-state dispute settlement components, or ISDS. The bill was voted down 61 to 60 yesterday and is being called unconstitutional by legal experts, as it undermines the executive branch of the New Zealand government. ISDS clauses are a class of provisions in some free trade agreements allowing companies to take legal action against decisions by a government that is party to the agreement if they feel those decisions are detrimental to their investments. New Zealand First MP Fletcher Tabutau sponsored the bill in a bid to protect the public interest. He says he's deeply concerned at the non-trade elements of the Trans-Pacific Partnership discussions and other proposed trade deals which may allow foreign corporations to sue governments. Chapman Tripp partner Daniel Calderemus, head of the firm's international arbitration practice, isn't surprised by the bill's failure. He says the proposed legislation verged on the unconstitutional. He said what it purports to do is fetter the power of New Zealand to make treaties. In constitutional theory, treaty making is a power of the executive. It's not a power of Parliament. So this bill would essentially be Parliament attempting to restrain that executive power. Mr. Calderemus says there is a real constitutional question about whether that's appropriate or possible. Most politicians would be likely to think a bill preventing the executive from making treaties is not appropriate. New Zealand Council of Trade Union Secretary Sam Huggard supported the bill when it was introduced, and today, despite its failure in Parliament, he said the usefulness of the bill for us was that it prompted the debate about the New Zealand government's response to ISDS. Mr. Huggard says our view is that ISDS is a very dangerous component of investment treaties. Having these sorts of provisions which limit the ability of domestic governments to carve up their policy decision-making space is completely inappropriate. The CTU is concerned about the overall concept of ISDS, particularly in the context of the TPP, and is calling for the provisions to be dropped from TPP negotiations. Mr. Huggard says the CTU raised similar concerns earlier this year about ISDS provisions in the New Zealand-Korea FTA. Nationals Mark Mitchell said the bill would make it difficult to enter into new trade deals such as the TPP and the soon-to-be-ratified New Zealand-Korea Free Trade Agreement, and negate current trade deals such as the New Zealand-China FTA, which would be disastrous for the economy. The Fighting Foreign Corporate Control 2015 bill was voted down 61 to 60, with National Act and United Future parties opposed.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett, your home away from home, but with better service. NBR Radio.
Let's go to Sydney. Restrictions on foreign buyers have failed to cool the Australian housing market over the past year, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. New figures from the Domain Group show the median house price in Sydney rose 22.9% in the year to June to over $1 million Australian dollars. All buyers of property in Australia also face a tax on capital gains and stamp duty. To a degree, this is how long is a piece of string debate. Proponents of foreign buyer restrictions and taxes on property transactions in New Zealand say the Australian market would be even hotter without them. But nevertheless, the latest Aussie stats show foreign buyer restrictions are no magic bullet. Australia has been tightening the screws on non-resident buyers since 2010. Echoing the policy proposed by Labour, the Greens and New Zealand First, foreign buyers cannot buy existing housing stock, although they can apply to the Foreign Investment Review Board for case-by-case exemptions. The pro-restrictions camp says the Australian restrictions haven't been adequately policed. Friends, family and shelf companies have been used to skirt the rules, and offenders have only faced a stern talking to. They can also be ordered to sell a property within 90 days. More than 200 investigations are open, but the FIRB doesn't have the resources. It began with only 8 staff to scrutinise every house sale. Extra resources are being thrown at the problem, but with the entire market to monitor for sneaks, the question is whether it can ever be enough. The Abbott government is introducing 2 measures to tighten things up from December. Under the first measure, foreign buyers who breach the rules will face 3 years in jail and fines of $127,500 Australian for individuals and $637,500 for companies. Third parties, including real estate agents and developers who knowingly help those buyers, will also be penalised with fines of up to $42,500 for individuals and $212,500 for companies. The second measure is a new home buying application fee that applies to non-resident buyers of $5,000 on the first million plus $10,000 for every extra $1 million of the purchase price. Will those measures make non-resident buyers think twice? As in New Zealand, there are counter-pressures, including a falling dollar that makes homes more attractive to foreigners and a freeing up of onshore investment rules for citizens in China, which one real estate agency estimates will pump an extra $16 billion into the New Zealand market alone. Let's talk rugby junkets. MPs travelling to the UK in September for the Parliamentary World Rugby Cup have been accused of being in the pockets of corporate lobbyists. Winston Peters is among several MPs who will be absent from Parliament in September to play in the World Cup. ANZ has confirmed it sponsors the Parliamentary Sports Trust. A Sky TV spokeswoman says the pay TV company will be filming the event. A spokeswoman from Air New Zealand says the national carrier has had a long involvement with the parliamentary rugby team, which includes MPs and staff, to enable it to represent our nation against parliamentary teams from other countries. We provide discounted flights and do not have anyone attend the event. Green Party co-leader Materia Ture says MPs travelling with corporate lobbyists opens a major can of worms. She says, my concern lies with the corporates and the privileged access by corporate lobbyists. She says the trip is considered to be parliamentary business, meaning MPs who go will have some kind of ethical obligation regarding who they're talking to and working with. One of the major concerns is the extent to which the privileged people get access to MPs and ministers. Jason Walls spoke to Winston Peters.
So you're paying for it yourself?
We're all paying.
All this business about you being in the pocket of a corporate lobby of the Parliamentary Sports Trust, that's not true?
No, the Sports Trust was established by the parliamentary group for netball, soccer, rugby and events like that.
They're sponsored by a number of corporates.
That's right.
Do you not see where we're coming from here, that it looks like you're sort of in the pocket of this lobby group?
Really? Well, then why has New Zealand First had, for example, where Sky Television is concerned, a policy since 1993 for free-to-air, and it's insisting upon it as late as the Samoan All Black game?
Other MPs who will be joining Mr Peters are National Sam Lotohinga, Paul Goldsmith, Alfred Ngaro and Mark Mitchell, and Labour's Damien O'Connor, Stuart Nash, Peeni Henare and Kelvin Davis.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.